Pandemics in history. Throughout the course of history, disease outbreaks have ravaged humanity, sometimes changing the course of history and, at times, signaling the end of entire civilizations. The past provides a prologue for any discussion on emerging infectious diseases. It could be on the biological origins of a potential pandemic or its social repercussions. The pandemics of the past can teach us a lot about the interactions between science and society. By studying the bubonic plague, we gain insight into the origins of quarantine. Cholera clearly shows the importance of sanitation in our cities. Recent pandemics demonstrate the importance of communication and infrastructural preparedness. Ancient China. About 5,000 years ago, an epidemic wiped out a prehistoric village in China. The bodies of the dead were stuffed inside a house that was later burned down. No age group was spared, as the skeletons of juveniles, young adults and middle-aged people were found inside. The archaeological site is now called Hamin Manga. The epidemic must have spread rapidly, there was no time for proper burials, and the site was not inhabited again. Another prehistoric mass burial of the same time period was found at a site called Miaozigu, in northeastern China. Together, these discoveries suggest that an epidemic ravaged the entire region. Around 430 BC an epidemic ravaged the people of Athens and lasted for 5 years. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 100,000 people. What exactly caused this epidemic has long been a source of debate among scientists. A number of diseases have been put forward as possibilities, including typhoid fever and Ebola. Many scholars believe that overcrowding caused by the war with Spartans exacerbated the epidemic. Sparta's army was stronger, forcing the Athenians to take refuge. They were behind a series of fortifications called the Long Walls that protected their city. Despite the epidemic, the war continued on, not ending until 404 BC. Athens was forced to capitulate to Sparta. Antonine Plague. Much later, elsewhere, soldiers returned to the Roman Empire from campaigning. They brought back more than the spoils of victory. Antonine Plague. The Antonine Plague, which could have been smallpox, spread among the army. It may have killed over 5 million people in the Roman Empire. Many historians believe that the epidemic was first brought into the Roman Empire by soldiers. They were returning home after a war against Parthia. The epidemic contributed to the end of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period from 27 BC to AD 180. It was when Rome was at the height of its power and glory. After AD 180, instability grew throughout the Roman Empire. It experienced more civil wars and invasions by barbarian groups. Christianity became increasingly popular during the time after the plague occurred. Thebes, Egypt. In Egypt, the remains were found where a bonfire incinerated many of the victims. It was due to an ancient epidemic in the city of Thebes. Cyprian Plague. A city in Tunisia is named after Saint Cyprian, a bishop of Carthage who described an epidemic as signaling the end of the world. The plague of Cyprian is estimated to have killed 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. In 2014, archaeologists in Luxor found what appears to be a mass burial site of plague victims. Their bodies were covered with a thick layer of lime which is historically used as a disinfectant. Archaeologists found 3 kilns used to manufacture lime and the remains of plague victims burned in a giant bonfire. Experts aren't sure what disease caused the epidemic. Justinian Plague. The Byzantine Empire was ravaged by the bubonic plague, which marked the start of its decline. The plague reoccurred periodically afterward. Some estimates suggest that up to 10% of the world's population died. The plague is named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian who reigned during AD 527 to 565. Under his reign, the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest extent. It controlled territory that stretched from the Middle East to Western Europe. Justinian constructed a great cathedral known as Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom. It was in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the empire's capital. Justinian also got sick with the plague and survived. However, his empire gradually lost territory in the time after the plague struck. The Black Death traveled from Asia to Europe, leaving devastation in its wake. Some estimates suggest that it wiped out over half of Europe's population. It was caused by a strain of the bacterium Yersinia pestis that is likely extinct today. It was spread by fleas on infected rodents. During 14th century traders from Europe made their trip to China to bring silk and fur. A group of Genoese traders returning fled from a band of Tartars and took refuge in Kaffa in Crimea. Tartars besieged the town for 3 years without much headway. One day Tartars stopped attacking threw rocks and stones over Kaffa's walls and began hurling in bodies. They were corpses of their own men who had died of bubonic plague. With this bacteriological warfare, Tartars started off the worst pandemic in the history of mankind. As the plague-ridden bodies landed, the whole town got infected. Then Tartars suddenly ran away, probably unable to cope up with their mounting losses from plague. The Genoese survivors too ran to their ships and sailed away. Many of them died on shipboard. The rest landed in Constantinople, Genoa, Venice and other ports where they infected families and friends. The bodies of victims were buried in mass graves. The plague remained smoldering for 300 years, flaring up whenever susceptible people crowded together. The plague changed the course of Europe's history. With so many dead, labor became harder to find. It brought better pay for workers and the end of Europe's system of serfdom. Studies suggest that surviving workers had better access to meat and higher quality bread. The lack of cheap labor may also have contributed to technological innovation. Cholera. The infection that caused the Cholera epidemic was a form of viral hemorrhagic fever. It killed 15 million inhabitants of Mexico and Central America. Among a population already weakened by extreme drought, the disease proved to be utterly catastrophic. Cholera is the Aztec word for pest. A recent study had examined DNA from the skeletons of victims. It was found that they were infected with a subspecies of Salmonella known as S. paratyphi. It causes enteric fever, a category of fever that includes typhoid. Enteric fever can cause high fever, dehydration and gastrointestinal problems. American plague. The American plagues are a cluster of Eurasian diseases brought to the Americas by European explorers. These illnesses, including smallpox, contributed to the collapse of the Inca and Aztec civilizations. Some estimates suggest that 90% of the indigenous population in the Western Hemisphere was killed. The diseases helped a Spanish force led by Hernán Cortés to conquer the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519. Another Spanish force led by Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incas in 1532. The Spanish took over the territories of both the empires. In both cases, the Aztec and Incan armies had been ravaged by disease and were unable to withstand the Spanish forces. Soldiers from Britain, France, Portugal and Netherlands began conquering and settling in the Western Hemisphere. They were helped by the disease that had vastly reduced the size of any indigenous groups that opposed them. Plague in London. The Black Death's last major outbreak in Great Britain caused a mass exodus from London, led by King Charles II. The plague started in April 1665 and spread rapidly through the hot summer months. Fleas from plague-infected rodents were one of the main causes of transmission. By the time the plague ended, about 100,000 people, including 15% of the population of London, had died. There was only one pest house or hospital in the entire city. Plague officials locked up affected persons and their family. The door of the house was painted with a large red cross, topped by the words "Lord have mercy on us." A watchman stood guard day and night until everybody inside pronounced healthy. But for most of the sick, dead cart was the only way out. Many escaped their branded house while the watchman's back was turned or by overpowering him. By doing so, they spread the disease to nearby towns and finally throughout England. London. In London itself, all trade and traffic came to a standstill. Even the quack doctors who sold fake potions and pills disappeared. Nor were the reputable physicians of the day able to stop the disease. But this was not the end of that city's suffering. On September 2, 1666, the Great Fire of London started, lasting for 4 days and burning down a large portion of the city. Marseille, France. Up to 30% of the population of Marseille died as a result of a 3-year plague epidemic in the 1720s. Historical records say that the Great Plague of Marseille started when a ship called Grand Saint-Antoine docked in Marseille. It was carrying a cargo of goods from the eastern Mediterranean. Although the ship was quarantined, plague still got into the city, likely through fleas on plague-infected rodents. Plague spread quickly, and over the next 3 years, as many as 100,000 people may have died around Marseille. It's estimated that up to 30% of the population of Marseille may have perished. Russian plague. In plague-ravaged Moscow, the terror of quarantined citizens erupted into violence. Riots spread through the city and culminated in the murder of Archbishop Ambrosius. He was asking the crowds not to gather for worship. The Empress of Russia, Catherine II, also called Catherine the Great, was so desperate to contain the plague. To restore public order, she issued a hasty decree ordering that all factories be moved from Moscow. By the time the plague ended, as many as 100,000 people may have died. Even after the plague ended, Catherine struggled to restore order. In 1773, a man who claimed to be Peter III, led an insurrection that resulted in the deaths of thousands more. He was called Yemelyan Pugachev, Catherine's executed husband. 1817. First cholera pandemic. This was the first of 7 cholera pandemics over the next 150 years. This wave of the small intestine infection originated in Russia, where 1 million people died. Spreading through feces-infected water and food, the bacterium was passed along to British soldiers. They brought it to India where millions more died. The British Navy spread cholera to Spain, Africa, Indonesia, China, Japan, Italy, Germany, and America. It killed 150,000 people. A vaccine was created in 1885, but pandemics continued. 1855, the Third Plague Pandemic. Starting in China and moving to India and Hong Kong, the bubonic plague claimed 15 million victims. Initially spread by fleas during a mining boom in Yunnan. The plague is considered a factor in the Parthay Rebellion and the Taiping Rebellion. India faced the most substantial casualties. The epidemic was used as an excuse for repressive policies that sparked some revolt against the British. The pandemic was considered active until 1960 when cases dropped to few hundreds. Spanish flu. An estimated 500 million people from the South Seas to the North Pole fell victim to Spanish flu. 1/5 of those died, with some indigenous communities pushed to the brink of extinction. The flu's spread and its lethality was enhanced by the cramped conditions of soldiers and poor wartime nutrition. Despite the name Spanish flu, the disease likely did not start in Spain. Spain was a neutral nation during the war and could therefore freely publish early accounts of the illness. As a result, people falsely believed the illness was specific to Spain, and the name Spanish flu stuck. Regardless of where they came from or how they spread, most of the infectious diseases have one thing common. They have done their greatest damage among populations which were suddenly exposed to them for the first time. 1 out of 3 English children died of smallpox before their 3rd birthday. Many were blinded by it, and most were pockmarked for life. Shortly after Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1520, smallpox ravaged the Indians there, killing at least half of them. English came to North America a century later. By giving away contaminated blankets, they willfully spread smallpox among their foes. Throughout the 17th century, smallpox remained the major epidemic disease in the colonies. Several factors made smallpox a uniquely favorable target for elimination. The virus infects only humans, it is not infectious until a rash appears. It spreads primarily through face-to-face contact. Those who recover from the disease have permanent immunity. Its vaccine, which provides long-lasting protection, does not require refrigeration. The smallpox vaccination covered 80% of the world's population. It proved a far more viable means of disease control than either quarantine or isolation. hope that lessons from both the past and present can help us devise effective strategies. Mankind should be able to mitigate the microbial threats that inevitably loom on our horizon.